Jai Hind, Namaskar, welcome to Conversations with Colonel. Thank you so much for joining us on this amazing podcast with Sandeep Unnithan. Uh, Last week we heard from him about his journey of becoming a journalist and his experiences of doing journalism with the military all over India and abroad. We'll carry on from there in the second part of our podcast today. I hope you enjoy it. Sandeep, we've talked about history, we have talked about operations in 71, we've talked about operations in 2611 in a very different setting. I would like to talk about your experience in war zones across the world. I'm aware that you've been to Afghanistan, you've been to Sri Lanka. So, two questions I thought I'll bounce off you. One is how you have and you have operated with the Indian military. So, one is how do what is the difference you find in the way of Indians operating or the Indian Army, Air Force, Navy operating vis-a-vis the other militaries? And secondly, any profound recollections you have from your tours of duty or tours on the foreign battlefields, which you can share with us.
Well, Sri Lanka, first thoughts. I went there a few years after the defeat of the LTT in 2009. I was there in 2013 reporting from the northern areas of Sri Lanka that had been cleared of the LTT. The Sri Lankan military had taken over. And my abiding memory of that was the fact that the Sri Lankan military had erected gigantic victory symbols all over those areas that had been held by the LTT. And these were military memorials that showed triumphant Sri Lankan soldiers holding up a flag and a weapon. And they were fighting their own people. The Tamils are Sri Lankans. They are Sri Lankan Tamils. They're not Indian Tamils.
Absolutely. Even the language is a little different.
Yes. They were fighting their own people. And here you have a military that's fighting its own people, erecting memorials all across areas that it had fought its own people. And this was a complete awakening for me because I had seen the Indian military deployed fighting insurgency in the north, in Kashmir, in Punjab, in the northeast. Not one such memorial anywhere in any of these places, because the Indian military, like I said earlier, is the military of the people. It is fully aware of the fact that at the end of the day, it is fighting its own people in all of these places. They might be misguided, they might have picked up their weapons, but they're fighting their own people, and you do not commemorate, celebrate, and certainly not create victory memorials over your own people. So this was my abiding memory in Sri Lanka. And I said that, you're not going to be healing anything by erecting these kind of victory memorials. Because when I spoke with the Sri Lankan Tamils there, many of them said that, look, when I cycle past that victory memorial, it reminds us every single day of our defeat. The fact that we've been defeated by the Sri Lankans. And it is memorials like this, while they might take forward that narrative of the brave Sri Lankan
supremacy
thing. It is actually a supremacy memorial. It actually says that the Sinhalas have overcome the Tamils. And that, to my mind, was, I was a little saddened by that. I said, you're not going to have any truth and reconciliation by building such memorials, irrespective of how many lives you may have lost, because at the end of the day, you're fighting your own people. And this is certainly not what you do. And one other instance, and one very exceptional Indian Army veteran that I've had the honor and privilege of knowing is Colonel D.P.K. Pillai, who was
Guards.
From the Guards. You know his story.
Yeah,
30 years back in the northeast, leads his unit on a patrol in a village in Manipur, a Naga village. He's ambushed by the militants, given up for dead almost. He's been shot through the chest, takes a grenade blast in his leg, and as he lies down practically half dead, a chopper is called because an officer is down. A chopper has been sent to rescue him. And at that moment, he says that that chopper should actually take a little girl who's been hurt in that firefight with the Naga militants. And that girl is taken by the chopper, which then comes back for him. There's only room for one. That girl is saved. Colonel Pillai also saved, he lived to tell the tale. But that, to my mind, was the ethos of the Indian Army. That here you have an officer who's leading from the front, who's injured in the firefight because he's in the front, and then in his wounded state, when he could actually, when you have people, literally grasping at everything they can to survive, he says, no, maybe that girl, she's got her entire life ahead of her. She needs a chance to survive. And then he went back there to that village more than 20 years later, and in uniform, and the sights that you saw from that village was absolutely heartrending, where you had the entire village coming around and embracing him, and there was tears all around. I mean, they were sobbing. And today he has adopted that village. I'm not quite sure if he's adopted the village or the village has adopted him. But he's literally got a second lease of life there, and he works so closely with them, and they pray for him so often. So this is, to my mind, the ethos of the Indian Army, the fact that it comes from the people of India. It will do everything to protect the people of India. So whatever you may hear about incidents where civilians have been killed or they've been tortured, those are aberrations. They will be punished, because this is not how the Indian Army operates. The Pakistan military, I can imagine them doing
completely
the worst.
opposite.
Completely opposite. And at times I wonder that we were at the Kargil event a few days back, where General Joshi who was
General Y.K. Joshi.
General Y.K. Joshi, Northern Army Commando, then
CO-13 Jackrif.
the 13 Jackrif, 2 Parambir Chakras. I asked him this question, that what distinguishes the Indian Army from the Pakistan Army? And he said, we saw it right there in Kargil. They refused to take the bodies of their fallen soldiers, which is the bare minimum that an army can do when it's sent its young sons into battle.
Nothing could be worse.
And he says that we were burying their soldiers, we were carrying out their last rites, we were even writing citations for some of their brave soldiers. Captain Karnal Sher, who got a Nishane-Haider, which is the Pakistan equivalent of the Paramveer Chakra, his citation was written by an Indian brigadier who saw his gallantry right up front. So there you have it, that you have the Indian Army playing by the rules, fighting an ethical war, recognizing the enemy's bravery, burying the enemy's dead. On the other hand, you have a military which runs a country which has for 30 years sent not thousands but tens of thousands of their own citizens across the border to be used as cannon fodder, giving up its soldiers, not recognizing them, saying that we don't know who you're talking of, these are all expendable assets. For this military, everything is expendable. Even the state is expendable. As long as the Pakistan military stands, suggests that it's possibly not even a military. This is like a criminal organization. This is how mafias operate.
It's a criminal corporation.
It's a criminal corporation which has interests in land, which has interests in possibly drug trafficking, as we are told, and for whom bleeding its adversary across the border through this war of 1,000 cuts is all they're there for. And they will do anything to achieve that.
Absolutely. And there are stories about Pakistan Army. Forget Bangladesh. Just recently, I think 2 days back, there was an incident where they have fired on to peacefully protesting civilians in Bannu. Something like Jallianwala Bagh, So it just, you just wonder, what are these guys doing?
When I was reporting, when I was researching Operation X in Bangladesh 5 or 6 years back, I traveled through the museums that Bangladesh has set up, the genocide museums that they have set up to show the depths of depravity that the Pakistan military had descended to. You had rape camps that were set up where literally women were corralled, and they were corralled like animals, and they were raped for several days by the Pakistan military for a purpose. They plan to create a new race of people, a combination of Punjabis and Bengalis, and this would be the new ruling class of East Pakistan, that they would teach these people, the so-called inferior Bengali race, a lesson that was so terrible that the Pakistan military would never have to return to East Pakistan to do that again. And when this sheer enormity of this hit me, I said, this is not how armies operate. This is possibly what the Nazis did
Absolutely.
in the Second World War. Genocide, eugenics to create new races and all of that. Or what Pol Pot did in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge. Or what several such other organizations have done, ISIS for instance, or even Taliban for that matter. So my whole impression of the Pakistan army as a very professional army changed after visiting Bangladesh about what I saw there. And so I understand where they're coming from. So when I see what's happening with CI Ops starting from 1889, that how does a state allow thousands of its young men to be sent across the border as cannon fodder year after year after year. We're not talking year, we're talking in decades. They've been doing that for decades. Why is there no public outcry within Pakistan? And I think if India had started doing that, for instance, if we had started parceling Indian citizens and sending them across the border to fight, there would be a public outcry, there would be an outrage. How could even 1 or 10 Indian citizens be sent across to do that? So which is why we have two very different countries, we're two very different militaries. And I think the Pakistan military exists for a reason. It is to show the Indian army what happens when an army goes rogue.
Thanks, Sandeep. And you mentioned about Colonel Pillai, and a few weeks back, we had Major Mukherjee with us. He was an army doctor and he narrated a fantastic story of how Indian army did something similar in Manipur. Helping out a local village which was very cut off from civilization, and how the people of that state were very friendly and very supportive of the Indian military, despite the whole, anti-terrorism, insurgency and everything going on there. And I think that is the ethos of Indian Army, and probably that is why across India, Indian Army soldier is respected, whether it is in a village or a town or a city.
Absolutely. The uniform.
The uniform has tremendous respect. But, Army also has had some issues with the media, and you're a media guy. And there have been times when, media has reported on operational security. They have been at least accused of giving away operational security, which has led to complications in operations which were going live at that time. Right? How do you look at that?
Well, I think by that you mean the 2611 operations, which
2611, 99, Kargil, those kind of things.
Where I think it was a learning curve that for both the government, the army, and the media, early days of broadcast media in India. And I think in 2611, we all know what happened, where television channels broadcast live the locations of hostages in the Taj. They didn't realize that the handlers across the border in Pakistan were watching. They had a control room set up with TV cameras, because with TV channels tuned into Indian TV channels, and they were using them like CCTVs. They had a God's eye view of the operations in all of these locations, and they were guiding their understudies, these terrorists, on what to do. And you had a few days after 2611, not only the fact that those hostages who were literally killed by the indiscretion of the TV channels, 2 days later you had TV channels broadcasting the operation of the MI-17 slithering with the commandos, dropping commandos on the roof of the Nariman house, which again gave away the whole thing to the handlers, because the handlers knew exactly what to tell the terrorists. If you remember, the handler telling the terrorists, this has been captured, this has been intercepted in real time, where you had the handler telling the terrorists, please take up cross positions because the commandos are coming from the roof. And when a trained handler, and these are all either military or ex-military handlers who are sitting in the control room, when they see commandos slithering down, they know exactly
How they
the
will
weapon
operate.
profile of the commandos, for instance. And he knows that the commandos aren't carrying heavy weapons, they're carrying 9mm, so you can barricade yourself. 9mm bullets won't penetrate. Possibly this is the kind of instructions that were relayed to the terrorists on the ground. And this was being broadcast live. It was absolutely uncalled for. It should have been clamped down right away. It should never have happened. Like I said, it was a learning process for both the military and for the media. It hasn't happened since, fortunately.
I think some lessons have been learned.
Huge lessons have been learned. Now it's the concept of certainly broadcasting live operations has ended. The government has realized. But this was a lesson that was learned in blood, because we lost so many civilians in Taj in 26/11 when the terrorists came running and looking for them, and the first few civilians that they got hold of, they murdered all of them. And this is because the locations had been revealed. And these lessons, fortunately, have been implemented now on the ground. So you don't see those kind of transgressions, especially along the LOC with, especially along the LAC with China, where the possibility that media entering the theater, where you have a standoff between China and India, live reporting of that could possibly complicate this situation. So you have a complete clampdown on reportage from the LAC, because you don't get the same kind of freedom across China. Of course, we know that.
Correct.
It's a communist dictatorship there. But a lot of lessons have been learned from 26/11. And if you look at the positive side, the media has also played a positive side. Let's not forget that. It is no longer possible to, say, cover up on military operations,
Right.
or something like, on the scale of 1962. A lot of questions would be asked, as they were of
Absolutely.
2020 in Ladakh when it happened. The media was there at the forefront reporting all of this without any prejudice, of course, to the military, not compromising any operations, but a lot of tough questions were asked about that.
It does bring in accountability with
It
them.
brings in accountability, because at the end of the day, we are a democracy, and the Indian Army is also one of the very important pillars of Indian society, and there are certain questions that were asked of it, and these, of course, were factored in the kind of decisions that were taken of at that time, 4 years back, and checks and balances were brought in, formations were moved up, and all of that. So this is a part of the learning process for both, I think, the military and the media.
Thanks, and thanks for setting the record straight. I personally believe, and this is my personal belief, that whatever happened during 26/11 or Kargil or in other operations where media got involved, I think it was more of an inadvertent, mistake, or
Yes.
in the josh of getting that first bite and the first scoop and the first news where things happened. I think we've come a long way from there, and I don't personally ascribe any malintention to the
Yes.
media.
Yeah, absolutely not. I
No
don't think it was any malintention on anyone's part. It's just that these lines were broken in this rush for breaking news.
Correct.
So that's what literally happened. You had this fierce competition between journalists to break news, and that was the nature of television in those days. A very young medium. It was it was in its adolescence, but now I think it's matured a bit. Though sometimes I don't get that sense when I see the 9 p.m. But I think by and large, when it comes to issues like national security and live reportage of wars or counter-terror operations, you wouldn't see these kind of mistakes being made, because lessons have been learned on both sides, and we would certainly not want to report on operations which compromise the security of our soldiers or indeed the civilians who are in the line of fire.
Recently, Sandeep, you are aware, and you are a keen Pakistan watcher, as you watch even China and basically national security. There's been a lot of noise from the Pakistani side about restarting conversations with India. Business to business, people to people, Aman ki Asha, whatnot. What's your take on this? Should we get back on the table, or should the government of the day, as they have espoused, remain that until the terror activities stop, we're not talking to you?
Well, the government line is talks and terror don't go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
And there's a certain logic to this, because If you look back at history, the Pakistan army, which is actually calling the shots in Pakistan, believes that India has no option but to talk to Pakistan, irrespective of what the Pakistan military does, which is carrying out terror attacks in Jammu and Kashmir through the Indian hinterland. And in a sense, that is where they've trapped previous governments. But this government has kind of held its ground on the fact that talks and terror don't go hand in hand. You cannot be running an infrastructure of terror, which is this entire mechanism of recruiting, brainwashing, training, and then pushing terrorists into India, and at the same time expecting us to continue with dialogue. Dialogue to what end? When you're continuously pushing terrorists across the line of control to carry out attacks on our side, knowing full well that this is a game that India never plays. We cannot do the same thing that the Pakistan army does. And this is what has emboldened the Pakistan army to continue with this process of dialogue and terrorism, where they ratcheted up the pressure when they feel like, when they lower it when they are under pressure. So I think there is logic to the government's stance on talks and terror not going hand in hand. Because literally, what can Pakistan offer you today?
Nothing.
Absolutely.
Absolutely nothing.
Grass, perhaps.
Yeah, they got the bomb. Now they're eating grass. I think there was a very good quote you gave, Sandeep, right in the beginning of the show. And now we are at the end of the conversation. But before we go, some fast-paced answers and short questions. You had a military background, but you chose journalism. If not journalism, then what?
If I wasn't a journalist, I would have been an archaeologist.
Digging up the past.
Absolutely.
On a scale of 10, and this is a light answer we ask all our guests, and there is a lot of trolling that we also get on our YouTube channel, that why do you castigate one particular service and the other. But on a scale of 10, rate Army, Navy and Air Force. And I know that you have seen all of them, and please don't be shy of saying what you think.
But that's a tough one. I mean, I can't say one service is better than the other. I think they're all equally good in their own ways. The army is good at, as I've just described, why they're so good at what they've done, because they're in contact with the people at all times. The Air Force, if you look at the number of missions that they've flown to save Indian civilians wherever they may be struck or stranded, or mount the kind of operations that you can't think of, or the Navy for that matter, which is all over the Indian Ocean region today. Wherever you go, there's an Indian naval warship present to, save merchant shipping, to save Indian mariners, to save Indian civilians. So it's a tough one, really. I think I'd give all of them the same marks. I'd probably give them 10 on 10.
Wow. I think at least the forces will be happy. So Sandeep, what has been the happiest moment of your journalistic life?
Happiest moment of my journalistic life would have to be a story, because at the end of the day, nothing gives a journalist more satisfaction than breaking a story or highlighting a story or seeing a story make some kind of impact. And I think one of my most memorable stories is the revelations of the surveillance on Subhash Chandra Bose.
I think 16, 17 somewhere.
In 2015, when we broke the story of the family of Netaji Subhash Bose being under surveillance by the state for more than 2 decades after his death, or his disappearance, as many people say, in 1945. The British-era surveillance had continued for several decades after that. That was a story that I wrote on when I was in India Today. That had a lot of impact in the sense that it led to the government, both in Kolkata and in New Delhi, declassifying a whole lot of papers that were connected to Netaji. The Netaji files were declassified that were kept in the government, in the MEA, in the state archives. And that actually brought up a revival of this great son of India that we knew so little about. He was one of those historical figures that had been glossed over simply because of the path that he chose, a path of armed insurrection against the British. There was a non-violent path that the Congress and Mahatma Gandhi had chosen. There was a path of violent resistance that Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had chosen, which is to ally with the Axis powers, first Germany and then later the Empire of Japan. And you saw those battles being fought literally on India's doorsteps. He was an extraordinary leader, a leader of the kind that we haven't seen in the 20th century. And so I was immensely grateful at this opportunity that we had to show what he had really done for the country in the years that he had spent, the kind of escapades that he had undertaken, traveling in disguise across Afghanistan, through the Soviet Union and Germany, and then that boat ride, the U-boat ride across Asia and into the Japanese Empire, and then leading this Indian National Army. Fabulous story of this very great son of India. So that story, more than any other story I've done in my career, I think that got me a lot of personal satisfaction. And every time I pass his statue there at India Gate, I always remember the fact that possibly me and my friend Anuj Dhar, who's a Netaji historian who helped get those papers from the archives, both of us contributed in some way to illuminate the fact that there were other freedom fighters as well who played a huge role in giving us freedom. Because I know this for a fact, Colonel Apte. I mean, I've interviewed the original mutineers of the Royal Indian Navy in Bombay in 1945-46, the Royal Indian Navy mutiny of 1946.
Many consider that as a trigger for British to leave
Absolutely.
India.
Because when I spoke with him, B.C. Dutt, one of the main conspirators of this RIN mutiny, he said that, when we were in the Navy, we had no idea of Netaji Subhash Bose or the INA. This was India under an emergency of the Second World War. All communication, there was a blackout. And when they heard of the INA and the role that they had played in fighting the British, this armed insurrection, he says, we decided to spontaneously rise up in revolt. And that, as you pointed out, is one of the reasons that forced the British to hasten their departure from India. They realized that this was possibly just the beginning. Empires fear nothing more than armed insurrections. Peaceful protests, satyagrahis, they can handle. They can throw them into prison. They can break their spirit. They can send them to Kala Pani. Armed insurrection means the end of everything that they have known. This, the British Empire saw in the Americas in the 18th century. And they possibly saw this coming in 1946 with over 2 million Indian soldiers that had been demobbed. The possibility of them rising up in revolt, inspired by Netaji Bose and the INA, was something that they greatly feared. There are plenty of examples, there are plenty of anecdotes of British administrators of that time, including Prime Minister Attlee, who said one of the reasons that hastened their departure was this prospect of an armed revolt
in India. Sandeep, I can see that you're a very researching guy, and there was a old, I think, podcast or interview of yours which I'd heard, in which you highlighted the perils of researching confidential information from the past in India. I believe there was something about the policy which talks about what archived information can be, opened out, being confidential itself. Is it something like that?
Well, it's about that when the declassification policy. So journalists like us thrive on archives.
Correct.
In a certain time frame, what happened in the past, 25 years back, 50 years back. So when a few years back, a journalist asked for the declassification policy of the Ministry of Defense in India, he got the answer, there is a declassification policy, but the declassification policy itself is classified. So
it's straight out
straight out of Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister. So this is the Indian bureaucratic state for you, which classifies everything. Everything is classified. Everything is secret. There is no classification. There is a classification policy. The classification policy itself is classified because nobody wants to stick their neck out at the end of the day and say that, this is something that we would declassify, or this is something that we make available for the public. Because what you're doing at the end of the day is you're taking away massive chapters of your own history away from your people.
Correct.
Like Operation X, for instance, I would never have been able to write that book if I had not met this extraordinary officer, this extraordinary gentleman, Captain Mohan Narayan Rao Samant. And I think all of India, all of the armed forces, all of the Indian Navy should be so grateful for the role that he's performed in keeping his diary and his notes and his papers that so meticulously documented this very unique operation. And then when I wrote this book with him, I realized that, my God, how many other such operations would have actually been carried out and which have actually just vanished. The entire Mukti Bahini papers in Fort William, all destroyed, all gone. All the papers that were recovered from the PNS Ghazi, a submarine that the Indian Navy sank off Visakhapatnam in 1971, all destroyed. Such a callous disregard for archiving papers, archiving history, recording history. And that is something that Indians have always been accused of. We are such poor history keepers. We don't keep records, we don't write our histories, we don't learn from our histories. And if you read what Air Marshal Arjun Subramaniam writes, that the Indian military has been deployed in all kinds of terrain. It's fought in high altitudes, it's fought in Afghanistan, it's fought in the jungles of Burma. But all of these have just become histories and they've just been archived. We have not drawn any lessons from this. If you have 2611, you should have had by now a tri-services study group that would study this kind of an operation and disseminate this down the line.
Come
to
out
all
with an
other,
official account of...
An official account. There is no official declassified report of 2611 till date, 16 years after that has been carried out. Kargil was a rare example of the government of the day saying that we need to learn from what happened in Kargil. And you had this beautiful document called the Kargil Review Committee report, which has been declassified, that's available to the citizens of India. We need to do this. At some point, we need to see a report on what happened in Ladakh in 2020 and the clashes that followed in Galwan, where the Indian army eyeballed the Chinese. At some point, we need to see the Henderson Brooks report. Don't declassify the whole report. Possibly segments of it which are sensitive can be redacted, but the rest of the report could be released. These are reports that future soldiers, scholars, journalists, writers need to study and document.
Maybe we could come up with a policy what the Americans have and the British have of a time-bound declassification on this. Lastly, Sandeep, have you got any awards?
I haven't, but my team has won a lot of awards.
How come you haven't? I think you've done a great job.
I haven't applied for any.
Don't
Many
tell
of
me,
the
you need to apply
awards,
for it?
you have to apply, you have to say what a great job you've done. And that to my mind is anathema. If you've done such a great job, you should kind of be recognized rather than having to fill in forms. But I had a team, a very bright team of very talented reporters, producers at News 9 Plus, and they've won multiple awards. So I just happen to lead an extraordinarily talented team who've done some great documentaries, short form documentaries of the kind that no one else is doing in India, the kind of stuff that we do, which is talking from everything from politics to history to military to current affairs and science and human interest stories. These are the kind of documentaries that have been recognized because unfortunately I feel that television has stopped doing all of this. The programming that we all grew up seeing on Doordarshan and later in television has all been destroyed now with the kind of medium that television has become. It's become a shouting match,
talking heads,
breaking news, talking heads.
Thanks for doing this, Sandeep. Really appreciate it. And I see the core essence of a military leader by when you say that my team has won awards. I think it's a great lesson. I think it comes down from your dad and the legacy that you carry. So I'm sure your team is very proud of what you're talking about them. Lastly, there's nothing much for me to say, but thank you. And that is the end of the show today. And I hope you enjoyed this very deep conversation around history of Indian military, how they have fought battles from 71 to 2611, what ails the media, what what could be done as far as jointmanship goes. I hope you had, enjoyed the show. It was informative. And lastly, let me inform the audience that Sandeep is here today despite bereavement in a of a close family member. And thanks a lot, Sandeep, for doing this. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on your show, Konlapte. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.